After our interview, we've got a fantastic interview. This is someone who we have wanted on this show for a long time, and we finally found the best opportunity for it.
Yeah.
Because he's got a new book coming out, Silas House.
I'm a fangirl for Silas House.
Absolutely. I am too. I'm a huge fangirl.
He knows it too. I think that I think when we met with him, we were both really super excited. The man is just, I feel like he's a giant of the Appalachian region.
Oh, 100%.
He's so impressive, so kind. Just the most down-to-earth person. Also, I want to say before we dive into this interview, this was well before the flooding in Kentucky happened. I think that's important to note.
We recorded it before then.
Yeah, we would have covered that. But Silas has been doing a lot for flood relief in Eastern Kentucky.
Absolutely.
And we're going to link in the show notes some places that you can donate. Chuck, what did you think about the interview?
I thought it was fantastic. I loved it. He's just obviously has a good way with words because he's a novelist, but it comes out in his interview, and we cover topics from his books to politics, to the culture surrounding where he's from in Eastern Kentucky, and the difficult balance of being from there and loving where you're from, but also being disappointed in it at times is something we talk about so often on this show. He's got a new novel coming out. It's called Lark Ascending. I've read a decent chunk of it. It's a phenomenal book so far. I'm looking forward to finishing it. I think you all should check it out. It's publishing on September 27th of this year, but you can pre-order it from several different sources, and I'm actually going to link to some on Bookshop, probably from a couple of local Eastern Kentucky bookstores, so that we can help support them, support Silas as well.
And just kudos to Silas for all that he's doing, and we love him, and we're so glad he came on the show, and we hope you enjoy.
Well, great. This is going to be awesome. I know that we've been wanting to have you on for a really long time, so I'm glad that we can kind of time it to coincide with your new book coming out. To start,
right,
something that we like to ask people a lot, especially Appalachian creatives, is to tell us a little bit about where you're from. And I know for you it has a lot of influence on your writing, I imagine. So I'd love to hear from you a little bit about where you grew up and kind of like where you live now, your Appalachian roots.
It's kind of hard to say just in one sentence where I grew up, because I grew up in a tri-county area. And so it's like the little community that I grew up was about 500 people. It's called Lilly, Lily. And it was right where Knox, Whitley, and Laurel counties, Kentucky met. So it's kind of close to Cumberland Falls. A lot of people know Cumberland Falls, and pretty close to Cumberland Gap, that area. So it's sort of the foothills of the bigger mountains that were right there next door at Cumberland Gap. It's where it just really goes straight up. Where I grew up was very much a coal mining community when I was growing up there, but it isn't now. And they mined it out a pretty good while ago. But I grew up, in a beautiful little community that was really destroyed by a strip mine, and that had a profound effect on me as a child. And it really made me, it just shaped my whole life, really, because I was from a coal mining family. My papa lost his leg in the mines and went back in the mines and worked for 10 more years. He lost it, in a roof fall, and never lost consciousness the entire time. And then he ended up dying of black lung. Yeah,
awful.
And so my family had given so much to the coal industry. Yeah, as a child, I had to watch the valley that I loved so much be destroyed. So it was a real paradox, in that way. It was a very conservative place. We went to a holiness church, and our whole lives revolved around the church. Everything happened at the church, pretty much, And I felt a whole lot of love in that church, but I also, the older I got, the more condemnation I was witnessing from the pulpit, and so I kept backing up further and further. And so by the time I was about 16 or 17, I was totally checked out of the church. And of course, by that time, realized that I was gay. And so I started thinking a lot about, these people love me so much, but if they knew who I really was, would they love me? And most of my family lived within a 1 mile stretch. So it was a great place to grow up, but it was also a place, really shaped by industry and extraction and violence and all the stuff you need to become a writer, all the stuff you need to become an artist.
A lot of material.
Yeah, I was just saying your description of it is so vivid. I feel like it really takes you to a place and a time, and gives you almost like a Dolly Parton's "In My Tennessee Mountain Home" kind of vibe to it. That's what I'm picturing.
Yeah, it was. On one hand, it was like all the best of Appalachia. In the evenings, people would be out on the porch. We had company all the time. One night we'd eat at my aunt's house. The next night we'd eat at my uncle's house, and then they would come to our house. I was raised around all kinds of cousins, and up under my granny's quilt frame and all that. But on the other hand, my uncle was murdered when I was 11 years old. My neighbors were murdered when I was 12 years old. So my childhood was very framed by violence in that way. Like right when I started to become a teenager, the AIDS epidemic hit about the time I was a teenager, and of course that set back a lot of people's coming out process. The church was wonderful and repressive. I always want to acknowledge that the churches have done so much damage, but also churches have done a lot of good. And I think it's unfair to not talk about both of those aspects. And I'm grateful for the good that it did, but it also, it did a number on me too. It took me a long time to recover from all that. I mean, in a way I never will, to grow up as a fundamentalist, you never really get over that. So I feel like I had a great childhood colored by a lot of really harsh realities and a lot of violence. There were a lot of guns in my childhood and a lot of fights. And, I remember the neighbor, a couple who were always fighting, and they would fight down into the yard. And one time the woman threw all her husband's clothes into the yard and set them on fire. And then he came home and, a lot of drama in our little community, there at the foot of Slate Ridge. So again, I just fed on that conflict. As a child, I was just a glutton for secrets, and I was always watching and observing everything. And so I'm really thankful for all of that, the good and the bad.
I'm really glad you mentioned that about the church, because I think much like many parts of Appalachia, it is complex. The church can be a powerful community builder, especially in rural communities, but it can also be extremely detrimental and traumatic to people, and it's shown that in many ways. And I think a lot of people listening to the show have probably had similar experiences where it has been complex. So I appreciate you mentioning that, and about the strip mining and coal communities, because, I didn't grow up in a coal community, but I grew up very close to many. And it has a really traumatic effect when you look at the beautiful environment you grow up in and you see it constantly being destroyed before your eyes by these companies that are out there just to make a profit. And I was going to ask you about how your Appalachian roots influence your writing, but I think you very much answered that question. So I wanted to move on to something else. I want to talk about your new book. But before we get to that, there was a question I had, and this is prompted by the House of Representatives, U.S. House, voting to codify marriage equality, and you had some choice words for your representative, Andy Barr, who voted against it. And so many times on this show, we often talk about the struggle between loving where you're from and being profoundly disappointed in it, and the people that represent it, like Andy Barr, and some of the backwards policies, quite frankly, that are part of Appalachia, and we don't want to shy away from that. I'm curious how you approach that and how you balance that, and maybe in terms of Andy Barr or just in general.
Well, that's one thing I really appreciate about your podcast is that I feel like you all really look at Appalachia in a complex way. Too often, people romanticize or vilify. Both of those things are really harmful. To romanticize is just as harmful as to vilify. It's all simplifying. And so I appreciate that you all look at the problems in Appalachia as well as what's great about it. I think if you really love the region, you must talk about what's great about it and what we can improve. Um, and sometimes people get mad at me for critiquing it, but I just feel it's necessary, and it troubles me deeply, and I think it troubles me more to see those sorts of things happen in Appalachia because it's my home. It hurts more when I see it happening in Appalachia. Um, and so, there's so many factors involved, of course. I mean, there is gerrymandering, there is a, a, a constant disinformation system. Um, there's, you know, the corporate hooks are in everything. But we also have to be better voters, and we have to vote for our people and our own interest. And I know so many people who will say to me, I love you, but I can't vote for somebody who's going to be for gay marriage, or whatever. And I'm like, well, then love and acceptance are the same thing. You can't have one without the other. And it's the most frustrating thing about our region is the way that the region votes, because ultimately it does say a lot about who we are as a culture. So, one on one, Appalachian people I know are so, tend to be so open minded and often are very live and let live and et cetera, et cetera. But we can't deny as an entity how Appalachia votes. It's just the way, that's the facts. Um, and so I feel like all I can do is call those representatives, so-called representatives, out. They're certainly not representing, most of us. And at this point, I just feel like, all I can do is sort of holler my frustration and let it be known, that the man who's supposed to be representing my region, he's a bigot, and he's voting for a religious text instead of, you know, for his constituents' rights. This this role we're on, more and more, well, less and less separation of church and state, I think is terrifying, and it goes against everything that I believe in as an American. Um, and yet, so many people are supporting it. So I think it's the most troubling thing right now. The two most troubling things to me right now are the climate crisis and the rise of Christian nationalism, and we're seeing both of them before our very eyes right now. It's going to get worse.
I really relate to something that you said, and I want to pull it out because I think it's really important. Because I've had the same experience where one-on-one, my neighbors are more than willing to talk about me being bi or my disability or my politics or what I do for a living. And they're interested in it and want to know generally more about me. And that's what I've generally found to be true. And then you get on a broader scale and you do see the trend lines are not where you are. And I feel like that's sometimes, I mean, for lack of a better word, it's a bit of a mind fuck for people who are living as queer folks, as disabled folks, as minority folks in the region. And so I think that that's really important to acknowledge that, and I really appreciate you saying that, because I've never heard anybody say it, with that kind of straight language.
Well, the thing for me is that I don't understand it. I can't. people ask me all the time to explain it to them. I don't know. I don't know why it's the way it is. The same way that I don't know why, in my lifetime, I have seen such we've gone from a pro-union culture to an anti-union culture. We've gone, to an anti-worker culture in the place that has been worked the hardest, in my opinion, in the United States. I can't wrap my mind around it. I know there's a lot of propaganda at play. I know there's a lot of money behind that propaganda, but I also know so many good-hearted people who participate in it. And that's what troubles me so deeply.
You're absolutely right on the union thing, especially just boggles my mind, not just because of the deeply rooted history in the region of the labor struggle, but just how much has been taken away from people by like those corporations, by those special interests, and how it still is not getting through. And I think that something you said, this isn't really a question, but something I wanted to acknowledge, which is like the complexities of the politics and how there's a fine line to tread between being an apologist and acknowledging the real barriers that go with the region, with like voting suppression, gerrymandering, but also the fact that people do still vote that way. And I think, and I believe that you were an executive producer on the documentary Hillbilly. Watching that was such a great example of that, because so much of that was like showing like the good side of Appalachia and how there are spots of hope, but then at the end during the 2016 election it was just heartbreak. And I think that that's sort of the complexity that we strive for. And it's unfortunate, but if we're not talking about it, then we're never going to improve upon it. You're an incredibly accomplished author and you have a new book coming out, and we're both very excited about it. Lark Ascending. I would love for you to tell us what it's all about.
Well, I don't have a poster for it yet, but here's the cover. I really love the cover. But the title is one of the most popular pieces of music ever written is a classical composition called Lark Ascending. It's about a 15-minute, one movement piece of classical music that is just transcendent. I can't listen to it without choking up, and as anytime that I'm writing a novel, music sort of takes over to some degree. This is the first novel of mine to actually be named after a piece of music. But the book itself, the lead character is named Lark, and the song itself comes into play eventually. But it's a song about a journey. That's what I hear when I listen to it. And the novel is a journey. Really, the book grew out of deep grief, and to me, the book is about deep grief, but finding wonder and beauty that enables you to push through that grief. You might not ever get over the grief, but you're able to survive it by hanging on to those moments of beauty and wonder. And so that's the main thing the book's about to me. I'm responding to the grief I feel around climate change, the grief I feel around the demise of our democracy, the grief I feel around the lack of separation of church and state. And then also, I'm drawing a lot on just personal grief of losing a few people really close to me in quick succession, and just thinking about how I really believe that nothing changes us more than grief. And so in my book, it centers on one young man, Lark, who has basically lost everything, and he's on this journey trying to find a safe place. It's unusual for me because it's set in the near future. I've never written anything outside, reality. But the only way I could really write about what I see going on right now was to go about 20 years forward to see that fully manifest itself. And so the lead character is he's on a refugee boat fleeing the rise of fundamentalism in the United States, and he's trying to get to Ireland to find a safe place. And along the way, he sort of joins up with a beagle that he finds. Dogs have been pretty much outlawed, so the only dog that he's ever seen in his life, and a mysterious woman that he meets, and they sort of create a family for themselves to try to find a safe place. So while it is really different geographically, um, most of it's set in Ireland. It's still, he's an Appalachian. He's from the West Virginia Maryland border, um, and his family is an Appalachian family because even if I'm writing, set in Ireland or Key West or whatever, it's still, I can never escape that Appalachian point of view. So I just say that this book is taking, Appalachian people, I'm taking them global in this book in a way that I haven't before. Um, and it's an Appalachian attitude that he has and all that. And while it is different in some ways, especially time period, it's the same thing I've always been writing about because I've always been writing about created family. I've always been writing about the natural world. Um, and so in some ways it's really familiar and in some ways it's something totally new.
I am just so excited to read it. Just the description alone, I feel like it couldn't be more timely. I think that the discussion of grief is so necessary right now because I think a lot of people are feeling grief that's kind of diffuse and intangible. It's just hovering beneath the surface of our lives, and I think that a book that kind of takes all of our greatest fears and makes it a reality is something that could actually be quite cathartic. And so that is what really stands out about this to me is that discussion of grief. So when is the book out and where can folks find it?
It comes out September 27th, and anywhere fine books are sold, you should be able to find it. So I'm always hopeful people will, use independent bookstores. That's where I recommend people go if they possibly can, local bookstores. If it wasn't for local independent bookstores, writers like me wouldn't have careers, so I'm so thankful for those indie booksellers. But wherever you choose to buy books, I'm just glad for people to be reading.
Absolutely. I wanted to ask a really quick additional question on that, which is, what do you hope people get out of this book? Because I agree with Callie. I'm very excited to read it too. I think it's very, very timely, just with all the topics you mentioned. And I also like a little bit of a tinge of irony there with fleeing the United States for Christian fundamentalism to Ireland, which itself has its own wrought history of religious persecution. What do you hope people get out of it when they read
it? Well, the main thing is I want it to be hopeful. I want I want it to be a story about somebody getting through their grief and acknowledging that grief, but also, to me, the really important moments are those moments of wonder and beauty that he finds along the way. Some of the book is told from the point of view of the dog, which lends it that sense of wonder, because the dog doesn't know that death is imminent, and the dog doesn't know the world's ending. The dog is interested in loving and being loved. And so it's such a great perspective to use when you're, setting it against this sort of desolated landscape. So it strikes a balance where you're just not feeling, pressed down under the devastation. I also want people to think about the climate crisis and how we still have time, to do some things to make our world better, to save it for generations before us. I want people to think about how important our water is. And it just boggles my mind that we have to go and march in the streets to protect our water. Like that should be a no-brainer. We should always be protecting our water, no matter what. And so, but we know that Flint, Michigan, Martin County, Kentucky, other places don't have clean water. And so. But I also just want people to think about that sense of wonder, beauty. I want them to think about the divinity of dogs, the divinity of the natural world. For me, when I'm been in this deep grief, those are the things that have helped me. Animals, trees, bodies of water. And so this book is full of those sorts of things, that the world offers all these balms to us if we'll go to them. And so I hope the book reminds people of that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I love that there is some aspects of it from the dog's perspective, because that's so interesting. I have one last question, and then I'm going to turn it over to Callie, who has a great question to end us on. You did mention local bookstores, and I love that. In fact, one of my favorite ones, though not in Appalachia, is Parnassus in Nashville, Tennessee, where I used to live. I'm curious, do you have a favorite local bookstore in Kentucky?
That's a tricky question because I have so many of them. I want to call out two Eastern Kentucky bookstores because I'm so glad they exist. And one is the Red Spotted Newt in Hazard, Kentucky, and the other is Coffee Tree Books in Moorhead, Kentucky. I think it's so important for both these bookstores to exist because their very existence fights the stereotypes that so many people have about Hazard, Kentucky and Moorhead, Kentucky. Back when Kim Davis was the big topic of conversation, I was interviewed several places, and I would always, remind them, Moorhead has this great university, and Moorhead has a really great bookstore, and et cetera, and I just think it's a great way to balance out a lot of the horror stories that often get picked up by the news. To me, those people who are running those stores, those are, I don't know if they would say this, but to me, those are political acts. To have bookstores in a place where all over the country, as a writer, people will say to me, how did you become a writer being from a place of such illiteracy? How did you become a writer when nobody can read there? And people just hope those stereotypes are so deeply ingrained in people. And so I'm just so glad that Coffee Tree Books and Red Spotted Newt are there, And there are others within Appalachia, but those are the two that, are close to where I grew up that I'll just call out. And Joseph Beth Bookstore in Lexington has, was always sort of an oasis for a lot of Eastern Kentucky people would drive to Lexington just to go to Joseph Beth because it's such a big bookstore,
Yeah.
But there's just so many indie stores that I'm thankful for.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more with you. I think that the idea, especially as we have people literally rallying to burn books, being an independent bookseller is certainly an act of resistance. And I think that's important to note. So our last question is just a fun one. Do you have a favorite Appalachian folktale or folklore? I'm thinking mine immediately top of my head is John Henry, working class hero. So if you had to recommend to folks an Appalachian folklore or piece of folklore story.
That's a really interesting question because so many of those stories for me growing up were family stories. We had our own folklore in our family, but the one that a lot of people know, and I'm not sure if it's Appalachian, I feel like it is the story of My Big Toe. Do you all know that story of the man who comes back to reclaim his big toe? And it's just it was a story to get children to be quiet and to hush, and it was like the booger man will get you, he'll come back and get your big toe sort of story. That's the one that comes to mind. But for me, it was we had so many of our own stories in our family. I was just from such a family of storytellers, exaggerators. I mean, I still remember in about the 7th grade, I thought, everybody around me is telling stories, and I want to take it one step further, and I want to write them down. So it was like this real conscious decision to become a writer as a product of storytellers. So I was just raised in so much of that, all the time. But if you don't know that I want my big toe, look it up.
I'm going to have to look it up. That one is not one that I'm familiar with. I wonder if it's regional, but it sounds interesting.
I'm pretty sure there's a picture book of it too, but it's it's more of a it's been handed down. It's a oral tradition story. Yeah.
I believe my mom made me read it or read it to me several times because I would never shut my mouth growing up. I do remember it somewhat vividly, to be honest with you. So it's a solid one.
Most of those stories were scary. Like
Oh yeah.
my family we'd love to scare each other all the time. That was the big thing is if you could jump out and scare somebody, that was the biggest laugh you could get. So I think Appalachian people are like that. They love to do something to scare somebody else or to pick at somebody else. That's such a great part of our culture, I think.
Yeah, yeah, I love that too. The friend, it's almost like just we were taught from birth how to do friendly banter.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. I know we're a couple of minutes over and we want to be respectful of your time. We're so honored that you came on the show, and we are excited and happy to lift up your voice. We feel like you're such an important part of this community, and we're just so glad you're here.
I'm so glad y'all are here. You're doing really important work, and I'm thankful for it.